name is Petra Hendry. I'm a former faculty member in the College of Human Sciences and Education, the School of Education, and taught in the Curriculum Theory Project for 30 years. And now I am saying I'm not retired, but I'm reinventing myself as a public historian and intellectual. So I'm trying to, reinvent myself. So, but I've continued to do a little teaching in the college and doing some work for the dean because I just can't let it go. I don't recommend retirement for anybody. We still have to have this talk at some point.
I was told 375 by someone important in our household,
So,
a while to go.
But it is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Ng-A-Fook. He was a student here in the Curriculum Theory Project. Hey, from about 2001 to 2006, so almost 20 years ago.
2 weeks before 9/11 I got
Yes.
here, and I left 2 weeks before infantry.
Yeah.
Those are the...
And I will always remember that cohort because we had class, curriculum theory,
Yeah.
the day of 9/11, and the whole class was just dedicated to making sense of what was happening.
Yeah.
But in any case, he's a former student, graduated in 2006, and he has been a professor at the University of Ottawa for the last 20 years, almost 20 years, and also served as the Vice Dean of Graduate Studies in the college. So he's been both an administrator and a faculty member. The research that he did while he was here, and I don't know if you're going to talk about that a little bit, became his first book entitled An Indigenous Curriculum of Place, the United Homa Nations Contentious Relationship with Louisiana's Educational Institutions. And I was always just in awe of Nicholas's commitment during the time that he was here to work with the Homa Nation. He spent almost, 3-4 years, traveling. Hi, Tasmia. We're just introducing Dr. Ng-A-Fook. Working among the Homa, collecting oral histories, and really immersing himself in the culture of the Homa in order to understand better their history of settler colonialism, and especially the role that education played or didn't play in that, since indigenous peoples were really excluded from all forms of public education until, the 1970s, 1980s, till integration. But I admired his use of oral history as a way to listen and to learn. And he has continued to do oral history work as well as Carrere, William Peinar's sort of concept of autoethnography, and as well as looking at the larger systemic issues related to racism, settler colonialism, and the disenfranchisement of Native Americans and indigenous peoples, especially in Canada. And the way that he blends those three threads, I think, is just phenomenal. And it's resulted in 7 edited books, in addition to his sole authored books, 31 book chapters, 31 referee journal articles, 85 conference presentations, and many other forms of dissemination. I mean, it's really incredible. I'm going to pass his vita around. It's 45 pages long. Not to intimidate you. No, not to intimidate, but to show what goes into crafting a scholarly life. I mean, not only is there professional, your typical academic journal articles here, but Nicholas has also been prolific in trying to get information and the stories out into the larger community through podcasts, through his web pages, through editorials. I mean, again, it's not just, this is like it's a view into a scholar's life whose primary goal is to be a public intellectual, which I consider you to be. In addition to all that, he's gotten over $6 million in grants. And I think most impressive, though, is his ability through all of this to continue to maintain relationships and build community, which is really the heart of what we're trying to do as educators, is to understand our relationship to each other and to create a space in which human beings can reach their full potentials and learn to live in some sense of justice and peace. So I'm just honored that you're here and thrilled, yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas and I'll pass this around.
Thanks, Patrick.
You're very welcome.
Well, I had really good teachers. I can say that my whole life. Starting with my parents, and then I had really good teachers in high school. I had contentious relationships with some teachers. I had a really good teacher, Bev Green. She ran the badminton club, but she was also, her former husband owned the local newspaper, and she was the editor. And so she always stressed about what it meant to be a good citizen, even though we were in the club. But then the kind of public narratives that came out. So I was in the newspaper a lot when I was a kid for different sports and things. And just kind of her ethics, her name was Bev Green, in terms of thinking about other people, the other people's shoulders that helped you succeed in doing what it is you're doing. So just a lot of kind people, mostly women, that as teachers that just reminded me at different stages of my life and my career and at work about what service means and what kind of research, and then trying to make a difference for your local community, your family, local community, and then kind of branching out. So just major thanks for being one of those teachers and supporting me in doing that. I thought, because my approach in terms of thinking about a scholarly life in relation to social justice and trying to kind of manage, we were joking around before about, the heaviness or the busyness of service, trying to do your studies and then teach. I always saw teaching first as the primary role that I do as a university professor, even teaching in terms of being out in public, in terms of public service as an educator, and then trying to do the rest through that. So when I was teaching the courses at the University of Ottawa, so I'm a former high school science and history teacher, and I had my brief stint for the 1 year that when I came back from Australia, I did a teacher education program in Australia to Canada, was to teach at this inner city school. And I remember the principal, I'd received 3 job offers to teaching science in high school, and then one was to teach in terms of what they were calling, was to become a resource teacher for urban youth that were at risk of not continuing, so decide not to continue school or being pushed out of school. And I had about 10 students, and I got asked to teach English, math, and geography. So I was like, history and science, but she's like, you could do whatever you want, Nick. You can create the curriculum, there's no restrictions, and that's what really appealed to me, is that I would be meeting with youth and have a lot of flexibility to create the curriculum. And we did a lot of, in terms of me working with those youth, did a lot of things that, they'd ask, why is it that for the other kids' geography classes, they get to go visit Toronto and we can't go? And so the principal would be like, well, if you come up with a plan, we can send, because I said it's not fair, so I went and saw the principal, and we ended up going and seeing, we were studying, in English, we were studying poetry about the Vietnam War and conflict, and so we were looking, and we were talking about, for some of the students in terms of resolving conflict, and how can we do that through poetry, and how can you articulate your frustration and tension through poetry rather than the usual things that you might rely on that get you in trouble in terms of going down to the principal's office and then suspended from school. And then in geography, we were looking at sand dune succession, and so we weren't that far. This was in Barrie. We weren't that far from Wasaga Beach, and so I put together a little proposal saying that we're going to go look at animals in captivity at the zoo that was there, the Enville Zoo, and write about poetry around that. We're going to go for geography, study sand dune succession, go to one of the largest freshwater beaches in the world, and we're going to go, because my in-laws had a go-kart track, we're going to go have fun on the go-kart track, because, you know, we're going to learn, you know, what's it mean to be responsible and socialize together, like going. So it got approved and we went, we had a great time. So things like, you know, there was ups and downs that year, but it really had an impact in terms of thinking about the students that I let down that year. Like I had a couple of students where I felt like if I only knew a bit more, or only had access to a bit more research, I could have done. And I'll tell this is deferred, like later on, in terms of reading the work. When I went and took the job at University of Ottawa in teacher education, again, like teaching courses, I try to think because of my experiences with United Home Nation and hanging out with elders and the principal chief there, Bernardo Ripshow, she was all about her service to the community as a leader. And so like volunteering, and so they had elders festivals, they had public gatherings, they had political gatherings, educational camps for the kids, and none of that stuff would have happened like unless there was volunteers, like people, like elders, cousins, all rolling up their sleeves to make the educational programming for their youth to take place happen. So she had funding, but there was a lot of volunteers that helped to do that. And so that really inspired, in terms of when I went back to Ottawa to teach in teacher education, trying to figure out how to integrate community service learning in the courses, and then try to partner with either the local school district schools, or what did happen was with the Algonquin First Nation Kitigan ZB community. We did a community service learning project where teacher candidates and I, in a course called Schooling in Society, so we're learning about, you know, school and its function in terms of education, role in society, and how to be positive and negative. But part of that, we had a community service learning project in it where we went into the school and we partnered with a grade 6 class. It was elementary school teachers, and we met with the students and elders, and then they wanted to create like a short podcast. So like even at the very start, like so with students trying to create these short little podcasts, and they met with elders, and the elders came up with the students with different themes, and the teacher candidates' roles was to facilitate the technology, the recording and editing to create the podcast. And then we had like a day of you know, presentations and listings where elders and community members were able to come listen to the youth. We've done these interviews with the elders and created like around, it would be like, you know, access to clean water, stewardship of the forest and animals. So they had, you know, pride in who we are as people. Like, so those were what the students did, and then we created a little newsletter. So I always try to integrate community service learning, and I never saw it as extra. Like I didn't say, oh, I got to do all this extra work. I just saw it as, this is the course. This is how we access community and serve it through the teaching this course in the class, to leverage all the resources that we have at a Research One university, institution, teacher ed program to serve different communities. So I'm trying to have that mindset. So that really informed a lot of the projects and research that I did. At that same time, we had Avis Glaze, who was an advisor to the Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Education. And she came and gave a talk, and we were sitting on a bench like outside of I was calling her a taxi, and she's like, hey Nick, what are you up to? I was like, you know, I want to apply for this grant. I want to do this project where I create curriculum, co-create curriculum with youth and a couple of my students at they had what they were called urban priority schools in the school district for youth that might be, again, like, you know, pushed out or having to, you know, decide to stop going to school because they have to take care of family. And she's like, Nick, write me a 2-pager and put a budget in and send that in. And so I wrote a 2-pager, I wrote the budget, and we got funded, and we went to high school. And so instead of the students going to their regular communication technology course, we had 8 students for one course, another 8 students, and these were all students who were identified as being part of a behavioral unit. So they were like, they were involved with the justice system. Our philosophy was all about de-escalation, because for several of the students, they were used to a pattern where if conflict happened, they knew if they escalated it, the next step was principal's office, the next step was either in-school suspension. So they'd have to deal and communicate. It was just, they were used to that. So our philosophy was like, de-escalate, student agency, what do you want to do? And so we created, this was back in 2007, 2008, and so I had grad students working on that project. We had a lab in the school, and the students came and did their course with us instead. And we co-created the curriculum with the students to see what they were interested in. One project was, so I got funding, so I bought like stuff to do a news broadcast. So I got like a green screen and video cameras and like these brand new Macs, and that was the other thing. They said like, we don't have any computers, so they had the best of the best in this small studio that they came for the course. And then we would create issues that were important to them in school about injustices around for the news broadcast. And they would go and interview different people and teachers, and sometimes they get in trouble because we did the news broadcast and they're like, cafeteria food, why do we get this? Or I think Obama election was going, like, in terms of our civil rights and being able to vote. And so it was very interesting, and to the point, so I think we did it probably once every 2 weeks. And then, it was a big thing to try to produce like a news thing with the students, doing all the editing, the green screen, so you could see them behind a news desk and all of that. And then the principal wanted it every week, and then the principal wanted certain stories in there, like we want to talk about the use of cell phones, and we're like, no, it's their news broadcast. That's why they're so involved. So there were those tensions that were there. All the students that we had that year, except for one, ended up, they completed the year. We had another, I think Facebook had just come out, but all the school, MySpace, and then Facebook. Remember, I don't know if I'm dating myself, but MySpace, Facebook. So, but they were all filtered and banned from the school board, but they didn't know about Ng.com. So Ng.com was it was a social network platform like Facebook and that. So you could go on. So we went on and set up our own kind of Facebook network, and a student could go on and create their own social profile, and they were sharing stuff on that. And we talked about what does it mean to be a digitally responsible citizen. So this is back 2007, 2008, and what they would put. But the students would share a lot more about themselves. So one student shared like that he was Lebanese, and his Lebanese flag, and Ramadan, and what was important. Another was from the Philippines and shared, boxing and the Filipino flag. And one student that got suspended ended up doing all his homework using the social network platform. And that carried over to then using the social network platform, Ng.com, with an English teacher to teach the Forbidden City, to see how youth engaged each other and developed a community, studying a novel on the platform. So it would be like teaching like a novel through Facebook with students in a grade 10 English class. So I learned a lot in terms of that. Then informed, because I was out in the classroom with students, informed then how I was taking up different things with teacher candidates in the classroom. And some of the stories the students shared about, for example, one student about the injustice had turned 18, but they were suspended from school, but the voting poll was at the school, and the teacher wouldn't allow him to vote because he was suspended. And so he wrote an essay about that, and he was really finding things that the students were really engaged with to write about. That community service learning, then I transitioned to becoming director of our teacher ed program, and I thought it was so good, so important that we made it part of the teacher ed program. So every student has to do an alternative placement. They do, I think, 3 to 4 weeks of community service learning somewhere. So they got to organize community service learning and do that, and really think about, again, which is difficult because, in terms of the professional discourse around teaching and all the burden and extra responsibilities on teachers, what they have to do, to then say, hey, well, you got to do a little bit extra in terms of doing the community service learning or servicing the community in general as a teacher. So how do you rethink that? I think that would be a good research project to go and speak to teachers about, on the one hand, like about what I'm talking about is like, this community service learning and service, or vocation in terms of teaching, but then you have all these additional demands because of the cuts in budget to the public schooling system, that teachers are expected to be, mental health and well-being as a counseling, and then, well, in Canada, there's a lot of teachers now that, I don't know how it works still down here in terms of like hiring coaching and stuff like that, but a lot of teachers do most of the coaching in Canada, but because of the additional workload increase, it's very hard for teachers to have to pick and choose what they're going to do and to take care of themselves and their own families. So that was part of thinking about teacher education, and then I'd always been trying to advocate. One of the first research projects for a grant that I got just after that project was to look at the lived experiences of residential school survivors and do oral history. And so it was like a 2-year federally funded research project. It was like the first of its kind, like the grant, and then I applied for it and lucked out and got that grant. And then we had that partnership because of that work that we were doing in the school with Ng-A-Fook. So I knew elders and who were survivors, and with some of the research that came out of that to work with the survivors. So Bertha Commanda, her thing was like, every citizen in Canada needs to know this history, like so that it never happens again. So the cultural genocide never happens again in Canada. And what part of the project and a book chapter that came out with Brian Smith after was, so again, teacher candidates were going up. And it was part of community service, and they were interviewing, and they were part of the research grant, and they were interviewing elders and knowledge keepers. And then I had at the same time, this was after Stephen Harper's apology in 2007. It was Prime Minister of Canada did a national apology, much like Biden did just recently. And so there was a Legacy of Hope, and they created a virtual Where Are the Children, so you can go online and say wherearethechildren.ca. It's a virtual site that goes through the history of residential schooling, and then there's interviews, and so teachers and teacher candidates can use that. So we looked at, when we go up to Kitigan-Zibi and we would sit with residential school survivors and elders, often it would be at the cultural center. An elder, Peter DeConte was sacred firekeeper, he would do a smudge. And so there was a lot of ceremony and protocol before the sharing of their experiences with the residential schooling system. And then some students who couldn't go, they would look at the virtual exhibit to try to learn. And I had them write letters to the survivors about thanking them about what they learned. And you could see a noticeable difference between those that went there and did the ceremony and listened versus those that looked at the virtual website. So we talked about this pedagogical encounter in terms of the ceremony of listening through oral history, and what the differences in terms of what teacher candidates learned through doing that. This was before so after 2007. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was put together to do a study and a report, and the report came out in June 15th of 2015, and I had always been advocating, like, we need to be doing a lot more of this, we need to change things in our teacher ed program. At that time, we had an elective course that looked at, it was called First Nations, Inuit and Métis histories, perspectives and contemporary issues, but it was an elective course. And so the only way students would ever take that course, teacher candidates, was it was an elective course. And again, I was director, and by the time I became director of teacher ed, it kind of hit at the same time, 2015, that report came out, and I said, hey, every teacher candidate needs to take this course. Like, it's so important. And I had colleagues that thought it was so important, so we passed it through and voted. We were one of the first teacher education programs in the country where teacher candidates had to take at least one course. And the first 2 years I had teacher candidates be like, why do we have to take this mandatory course? Like, why? I'm like, the same reason you have to take any other foundations course. Like, it's no different than curriculum design evaluation or inclusive ed, or like, if we're on other people's traditional territories and we want to do our part in terms of addressing historical harms and redress, then as teachers that played a role in the histories of the residential schooling system, that continue to play an ongoing role, then how do we learn about that? How do we unlearn about that?
right? So that's Dwayne Donald that I work with. He's focused a lot of his work on the concept of unlearning. And so we talk about the school curriculum and the influence of the curriculum theory project and the work I did down here. I was so ignorant. Like I came down to Louisiana and Canada is founded on segregation of different Indigenous peoples, and then coming down to Louisiana and for the first time to really experience like my proximity to whiteness and white privilege and really learning the histories I learned down here, looking back at Canada and saying, wow, like Canada portrays itself as a multicultural nation and peace, and it's been anything but peaceful in terms of the policies that have been put in place. So the frameworks and theories that I learned down here, like I studied with Denise, Agia, Derrida, and then with Petra and the sports and gender courses, we're looking at Foucault and looking at. So I did a minor in women gender studies, and my question, so the course is like, can you become a feminist, man? It's like true, used to claim that, and then I took like 4 or 5 courses in the anthropology department because there was no classes that kind of. So I did a lot of coursework, and then my biggest education then was just being with United Home Nation. Michael Dardar, Michael T. Mayhard Dardar, was a travel historian. He gave me books to read that were histories that I'd never read before. So I don't know if you read is it Michael P. Lowen's book, The Histories, The Lies My History Teacher Told Me. So reading that book, and just so it was a whole process of unlearning the curriculum that in a Foucauldian sense, if we think about the government putting out, like whether you call it a core curriculum or a state curriculum and its history, that as a discursive regime, that history curriculum, as a citizenship curriculum, knowing about histories or public histories, it works to create a certain kind of historical consciousness that both includes certain historical narratives, but excludes. So it erases different communities as it includes them. And so I was really interested on how does the curriculum work to exclude different people's experiences of the past. Let's start there. And then how do we collaborate with communities to write narratives or re-story their lived experiences in relation to different historical events. So I was lucky enough to participate in the Oral History Project with the South Baton Rouge community and go and interview Pearl George's kids. Like I was sharing the other night, I went through the phone book and I was like calling up all the George. I'm like, do you know Pearl George? Do you know Pearl George? And then her daughter was like, yeah, that was my mom. And then I said, I'd love to come talk to you, and I went over to their house and had coffee, and there was like 5 of them, and we did an interview, and I went and interviewed Johnny Jones. I think he was like 86 at the time. He's like, come down to my office, and like we talked. He talked about being involved in the civil rights movement. So it was through those pedagogical encounters with human beings and their stories of their past experiences with those historical events. And then I would go like for Pearl George, because I think the year I did it was like around the civil rights movement. And I was working with 2 high school students 2 female high school students from McKinley. And we were interviewing their aunts. And then I would go to the library. Was it still the Middleton Library? Yeah. I'd go to the library and I'd go into look up in the newspapers and the microfiches to find so John Jones would be like, yeah, I remember when we did a swim-in and this happened, so I'd go look for swim-in on that date, and then I would read, and then the way the story was written in the newspaper was not the same as what Johnny Jones or others had, Pearl George's daughter had shared, right? So I think trying to think about each other as human beings and the stories we bring to and share in a classroom and how we juxtapose those or out in the community is really what's informed, I would say, most of my academic life in relation to social justice. And it's been the same in terms of the podcast and Fook in Conversation. It was a course, but most of the people that I've invited on are committed to social justice and addressing that in their work, and then trying to think about how I can share and mobilize their research and the stories and the way in which they do it so that others can hear their voices while you're reading it in the classroom. Yeah, so I'll stop there for a little bit, and if you have questions, because I've been rambling and talking for a while. I could talk for an hour. I don't know if you have questions.
I just wanted to know if you did an ethnographical for your dissertation on you. So was it how did you get close to the Homa Nation? I'm
Yeah.
not sure if everyone knows.
Well, it was mixed. It was, I was doing Miles Richardson's course. He was an amazing prof too. Like he used to go like during the Gulf War, he'd hold a sign peace in front of the building, like be out in the public holding peace. But I was doing an ethnography course because that was one of the qualitative courses we do out of the anthropology department. And I was reading, you know, I said like I'm from Canada, I would love to learn about, you know, Indigenous community stories because that's what my master's supervisor said. Like, Nick, now that you've done this, you need to go and collaborate and learn a different kind of history. And during my master's, my research question is like, how does one decolonize? Can one decolonize one's self, one's mind, right? So Miles said, Nick, you need to go down to Golden Meadow and go find out. So that was it. So I hopped in my car and I drove down to Golden Meadow one weekend. It was like Mardi Gras. And I hopped on my car and I'm like, hey, do you know where the Homa are? do you know, I have no clue what the Homa look like, or do you know where the Homa are? And then there was some Canadian families like, oh, come on in and we'll talk. They're like, there's no Homa down here. And like, I'm, you know, eating oysters in their house and just hanging out. It was Mardi Gras. I drove down by myself. And then, so I came back and I told Professor Richardson, I was like, yeah, I went down, they said there's no Homa there. He's like, really? He's like, well, you need to go down to Dulac. So the next Sunday, I drove down to Dulac, and I went to the community center, and I showed up, and I was like, they were just, someone was cleaning up, it was Zoanna Verrett, she was cleaning up. They had a food drive and clothing drive, like you could show up, and I said, hey, do you know where the Homa are? She's like, yeah, we're the Homa. And then I explained, I'm an international doctoral student from Canada, and I would love to learn more about your history and your stories. And she's like, you need to meet my husband, Kirby Verrett. He was the pastor of the church there, but he was also director of the American Indian Education Program for Terrebonne Parish. So he just happened to be at his office, so I drove over, and I'll never forget, he said, so I hear you come to study on Harvard on the Bayou. I said yes. So Harvard on the Bayou. He says, welcome. And he spoke French, so we spoke French because I grew up speaking French. I went to school in French up in Canada. So he said, you need to come to Ile-de-Jean-Chao, we're having a meeting. And he gave me directions, like just said, like I was writing them down, I had a little book, right? So like this is part of a course, like here. So I write down, the next weekend I drive, following, it's like, you know, take this road, go over this bridge. I'm like, I thought it was gonna be a huge bridge, it was like a little bridge. And then the red house, take a right and keep going, and then you'll find a church, and then come down to the basement. So I went down to the basement, and it was a tribal council meeting. I'm like, what's going on here? So, and then there was a student from France doing masters on their petition for federal recognition, and he gets up, he's like, yeah, he was on the agenda. I'm here from France, and I'm an international student, and I want to do research on this. And he had a whole thing, and I'm like, I've got nothing. I'm just coming to meet the Homa. So then they're like, okay, what do you, and this was Brenda Darder-Webisho, she was the principal chief. She's like, what are you here for? I'm like, I'm here to learn about your stories. She's like, well, what kind of stories do you want to learn? I was like, well, what kind of stories do you want to share? And she's like, I like you. And then she called her son, Josh Dardar, and Josh shared the story after. Yeah, I'm at home. My mom called. She's like, I got to meet this doctoral student coming from Canada. And so I went back to her house, and she's like, hey, you can meet my son. And we were in like the dining room, and then we just shared and met, and we became like, you know, best friends. And I'll see him this weekend, still hang out. Went to his wedding, and I just met with him. And then they'd have different events, and Brenda would be like, just stay at our house. So I'd go down. At the start, like I go down for weekends, and then eventually I have my own bedroom, and then I bought my own furniture, and then if I didn't have coursework here, I just kept going down, and then I just lived at their house. Anytime I didn't have anything in Baton Rouge, I would live at their house, and then Josh would just take me fishing all the time. So we'd go in pirogues, go fishing, and then I'd meet his grandparents. So his Whitney Dardar.
I just see how fun doctoral research can be. I mean, this is research.
Yeah.
You don't have to do questionnaires, you don't have to do surveys, you don't have to do numbers.
No.
You know, this is a testament. You can tell stories, do narrative qualitative, oral history research, and it is legitimate, and you can do it and go on and become a dean.
Well, I don't know, but I think I was lucky because I was a student, international student, not from Louisiana, so there's all those dimensions as well. But the big joke was with Brenda, every time I go down, she's like, you come and do research, you come and go fishing. I'm like, both.
It's one and the same.
Yeah, but like was going fishing down in Golden Meadow, so Josh and I would get up like at 4 o'clock in the morning, have the radio, we'd go onto his grandfather's like land, we'd put 2 pirogues in, we'd go fishing for the day, and we'd come back, and his grandfather either came back from trawling or from his oyster bed. And then I'd sit and talk to him. But Whitney Dardar's dad was the treater, a traiteur, healer in the community, and so a lot of people went to see his parents to be healed or babies delivered, and he had a lot of knowledge of all the medicines and the histories and everything. And then Brenda, because she was the principal chief, she was really politically active, not just in like the politics of her community, but politically active in like any kind of politics that was going on in the state. So really got invited, and then I was, and I wasn't collecting and interviewing anyone. I was just hanging out for 2 years, and even when I think it was the French ambassador came from France, like I got asked because I was taking I was just taking photos of family and stuff like that. They asked me to document a lot of stuff, so they asked me to record all the major events and then take photos. They asked me, they didn't have a website, so it came, like we were talking about leveraging the resource of the university. Here, my good friend and colleague Sarah Smith, she knew how to do use Dreamweavers to show me how to do it. So I created their first website for them and then put stuff up on it so they would have a presence on the internet. And then I volunteered at the summer camps. They had these educational summer camps in the summer, and so they applied and they got funding for a literacy program, and so they had this really fancy printer, and then I created a newspaper for the kids, a newsletter called the Crawfish Times, and so I would take photos each day at camp, and Josh, they would cook the food, and we called it Josh's Belly Review, so the breakfast, lunch, I'd interview him every day and be like, hey, okay, what's Josh's Belly Review? And then I'd be up till 1:30 in the morning putting together this 4-page newsletter so that when the kids came in for breakfast, they had a newspaper called Crawfish Times that they ate while they were eating breakfast. They could read and laugh so they see pictures of themselves doing that stuff. So coming back to answer your question, it was just spending time and rolling up the sleeves and volunteering and just doing whatever they needed to help doing and documenting. And it wasn't until my 3rd year when I wrote my dissertation proposal, I think it was at the end of the 3rd year, I went back to the tribal council and I submitted it to be on the agenda and I asked for approval. And by that time, because I went to so many powwows and I knew a lot of family members and hung out, that actually before I put the proposal in, I asked Brenda and others what they wanted. And they wanted a history, an oral history of their lived experience before, during, and after desegregation of the public schooling system. And so I came back, I wrote it up, and then presented that, and they approved it. And then I asked them to appoint a tribal council thesis committee. So I had 3 people who read my chapters before it came to anyone here, my advisors. So Brenda was on it; she read everything. Michael T. Mayhart Darder was he just loved reading and exchanging ideas. He was the tribal appointed historian. He read everything. And at that time, Josh was doing his master's at Arizona State University, and he read everything. And it wasn't until they gave their okay on what they read, and then everyone who participated on the oral histories got to see how it was situated in each chapter, gave their approval, and then it would go to my committee. So, and the committee was really good. I didn't get and I got asked the question your curriculum theory. Do you want more theory? I'm like, this is the Homa story education that's been approved. This is the way they wanted it, and the theories and the footnotes. But yeah, it was just hanging out and being there and growing up too. I was a doctoral student and growing up with Josh and Jason and Fee and then Dr. Michael Rubichaux and there's all the women that some and I'm down here in part this week to meet again with members of the tribal council to talk about, because I have 2 boxes with interviews, recordings with elders to see what they'd like to do with that. If they don't still have them, because there's some of those elders aren't with us anymore, and they're historical artifacts that they could have and create a digital archive if they want, decide what they want to share with the public or what they want to keep for themselves. So I hope that, yeah. So I was lucky, Leo.
Yeah.
I met the right people at the time.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my own is a follow-up question on ethnography. You currently taking a course, a qualitative research method course in Calgary, and we learned so much about ethnography, concerning how long it will take you to get data for the research process. So I want to find out in your case, how long did it take you to get data to do the study?
4 years.
4 years. So these 4 years was kind of like going to...
Well, you can't unsee what you see. So like, because I went fishing, I'm serious, because I went fishing for redfish, I'd have conversation about the marsh grass and saltwater incursion and how the Mississippi River and the Army Corps of Engineers built the levee system and it cut off the fresh water, and the Mississippi Delta, you don't have Mississippi River and it's just dumping on that. So that's from going fishing and of course reading books, because people be like, hey, read this book, read that book. But these are conversations about going actually out with elders, and they show you like, Nick, look, the marsh grass used to go way back here, and now it's in. And even from year to year, every time Josh and I would go out during fishing season, we'd be like, are we going to see the same canal or not, like in the marsh grass? Knowledge, embodied knowledge around fishing. I was so clumsy at fishing, like you would like go and not make any noise because you're like sight fishing for the redfish. So, the sun would be coming up and you'd see like the tail and you'd have to cast just on marsh grass going quietly, and then you see a big V and it hit. And he was awesome at that. And I'm like this with my paddle, and he's looking over. He's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? But
Scaring the fish away.
But then I learned, like, if you're talking about like ethnography in terms of space and place and culture and histories about the trawling industry, and the different roles that why women were educational leaders, because for several of them, their husbands different times were out trawling, or they're working on the oil rigs. Learning about the different seasonal, like, when it's time to harvest the shrimp, and the interconnection between the redfish and the shrimp and the oyster beds. And so that was, just going out and being there for 4 years, that was part of it. The oral histories were the micro histories of that place and space in relation to the historical systems of racial segregation in the South. And there's, so I didn't just do ethnography. I did ethnography, oral history, and historiography. So I would go and try to find certain historical documents, right? Like, so I read through everything that had been written. I tried to find as many theses that had been written, different people. H.L. Bourgeois, who told the Homa that they couldn't go to white schools because they weren't white, and they couldn't go to African American schools because they weren't black. He wrote his thesis here, master's thesis. So I went and read it, and the racism in there is right in your face. So I cited that in my book about that rationale for why he did that. So it was it was trying to juxtapose different sources, historical sources that have been documented, and then theoretically, whether you read Frantz Fanon's work, Edward C. Eade, or Linda Tuea Smith, her book had just come out in 1999 about how to, or an anti-colonial, or looking at how settler colonialism worked the history of that, but then looking at authors that kind of wrote back. And for my master's, theoretically, coming back to, can one decolonize themselves, I was like, okay, to do this, I got to read, because I came from a small rural community that was, hyper-masculinity and patriarchy up in Northern Ontario. I was like, I'm just going to read the scholarship of women, and they're going to be post-colonial scholars or Indigenous scholars, and that's going to be my theoretical framework for trying to understand my autobiographical narrative. So I'd write these narratives, and then I would go to see, okay, how is that? Where's the violence, patriarchy, or I'm structuring it in a certain way where, someone like Spivak or Linda Tuea Smith would come at it differently, or Petra Henry would come at it differently and complicate it. So I just thinking of how women came at narrating the stories we tell each other differently, and trying to unlearn the way in which I might tell stories or continue to tell stories. So that was part of it too.
I love what I hear you saying, and what I hear is this notion of research as unlearning.
Yeah.
And that's so the opposite, I think, of what we learn, the traditional academy and what is in most research, classes. So can you talk more about that process of unlearning?
Yeah.
Research as unlearning?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of Canada, but Canada is a settler colonial nation state. Like it's been formed through settler colonial national policies that have created a segregation system for First Nations that Métis and Inuit people over time, and those injustices are being challenged right now in different in the court system, Supreme Court, and it'll be ongoing. And there's political conflict on different sides about what people would like to do or not do. So for me, I'm trying to understand with someone like Dwayne Donald different histories and different ways of sharing those histories, so that we can have we can have more nuanced understanding, more intersecting understanding of different people's past lives to teach about that. So in some way it might bring us closer together to understand each other as human beings. So I don't think it's a bad thing to acknowledge that there's been historical harms. Like, even if you were a descendant or not, a descendant or not of being the perpetrators, right? Like, if you're implicated in itself, if I say, like, I'm proud to be a Canadian citizen, well, then what does that entails everything. That entails the historical harms to create a nation state that we call Canada, and also how we want to reimagine the future together with different people. So how do so again, a great teacher for unlearning for me has been Cindy Blackstock. She's a human rights activist, First Nations in Canada. She took the federal government with the Assembly of First Nations to court because of the inequities of health care for First Nation youth, both on and off reserve. She took it to the Human Rights Tribunal. She started that in 2007. They just found, like, a few years ago, in favor of her, I don't know what it's called, but the case that she brought forth. And now it's being debated because they were awarded $49 billion. But the federal government's like, we'll give you the $49 billion, but and then we're done with it for 9 years. And Cindy Blackstock's like, so then we're just going to go back to the way things were after 9 years? Like, it's got to be, if Canada was colonized and you're acknowledging that we're nation states and all of this money that you're profiting from as citizens, and you continue to do so, how can we be in mutually reciprocal relationships moving forward in terms of financial equity for our people, your people, and having access to health services? As just one example. The other would be public education, right? So that's, for me, I'm trying to unlearn the narratives that are shared and the kind of normalized narratives of settler colonialism that are shared as part of the public school curriculum or part of teacher education. So I would say, like, what role has teacher education played in reproducing those narratives, enacting those narratives, and then so how can teacher education work to unlearn that and teach multiple narratives that we learn from. So that's the unlearning process. So and the reason you use unlearning is we've had these conversations again with Dwayne Donald and others that decolonization, if it's going to move beyond a metaphor, it's about giving land back. So if you're not prepared to give land back, why say we're decolonizing the curriculum? We're working towards decolonizing. Could we decolonize our minds first versus unlearning? So I know Dwayne uses the term like unlearn. How do we unlearn these things that we take for granted? The everyday logics of settler colonialism.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, the one thing is that when you resist colonialism, that's when post-colonialism, decolonization comes into play. And there is this other part of colonialism, the other consequence, in a sense that when you internalize colonialism, and you internalize the practice of colonialism, and you sort of think that in many cases that was better for us, or they like how we look up to white supremacism,
Yeah.
how we look up to white narratives, even when we are looking into the theory of decolonization. So I was a student of literature when I was in my undergrad. So we took this courses, decolonization, post-colonialism, colonialism, like lots of courses on that particular subject. And this is very fascinating. Like, we learn how to decolonize from the colonizers in many cases. There are some exceptions, like you said, Edward Said is the exception, Spivak is the exception. And I'm not saying that a white person necessarily has to be, somebody who is not in favor of decolonialism or anything.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that how do you sort of fight back the fossilization that has been happening after the colonial era has gone, for a long time. So this is very sad in the sense that one of the best teachers that I've learned from, in many cases, when they talk about colonialism, they talk about nuances of, different theories and structures. Not necessarily that doesn't have to be colonialism, anything, post-structuralism, let's say. Somehow, somewhere in the room, it hangs there. Like we sort of give that idea, the privilege, and the Eastern values, the Eastern, Southeast Asian narratives are somewhat. They're not equally important.
Yeah.
In many cases, especially comes to, I think, you can see this at least I can feel it. In a country which is heavily influenced by its religion, its different cultures. So it's very difficult for us to segregate our religious practices and cultural practices, and because these two things are very integrated. But when it comes to decolonization, in many cases, the idea of secularism is sort of presented in a way that is lack of religion, which is not welcome in many communities, even in Southeast Asia. This is something that I'm still I'm still, juggling my mind with how to portray this, how to sort of capture the idea, because I cannot disregard a lot of people's emotion, a lot of people's experiences regarding religion and culture. And then sort of embrace something that is completely foreign and then call it our own. So then comes the fossilization that I'm talking about. So I don't know how to address that certain issue in that particular area, if you have a suggestion.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I don't that's something I continue to struggle with. And I gave you examples of being a teacher, a director of teacher education, and vice dean of grad studies, and I would say that higher education, especially my university, University of Ottawa, is so structured, and there's still a hierarchy. I mean, it boasts to be the largest bilingual university in the world. So we're boasting to be the best at colonialism in terms of French and English as the two official languages. And so I've had colleagues that are First Nations. In order to get tenure, you have to be passively bilingual, in both languages, and decide to leave. I'm not going to learn another colonial language. Why not give me the money to learn my language that's been, through the residential schooling system taken away, right? We were forbidden speaking our language. I've met elders of survivors that are so angry because they feel the language here, but it won't come out because they were punished to speak. So I don't know. For me, and I can't speak. For myself, it's trying to recognize the kind of structures of how universities and higher ed are colonial institutions, find one that's not, in terms of those hierarchies, and then what can you do within them, like just as an institution itself, and then trying to get out of the structures of the university, which actually means like leaving and going, like say, onto land to have a course, or we go and do events and teachings and learnings with Kitagan ZB communities out in their community, and as you said, like in terms of equivalencies, have elders and leaders of the community saying, I have a PhD. Like, in terms of you come out here and where I'm at in my knowledge, this is a PhD, it's lifetime. I'm seen as the expert. Why isn't there equivalency of I'm not seen like that? And the last example, which I'm still trying to figure out, so I'm telling you, I don't have any answers to what you just raised in terms of that, is we have an Indigenous teacher ed program. It's community-based, and there's two streams. There's one, if you don't have an undergrad, but you have a high school diploma, you can take it and you get a certificate. But you're not accredited by the Ontario College of Teachers. That's the accredited body. Some people say, I don't care. Like, I got this. I will teach my community. I have a high school degree. Maybe I have 1 or 2 years of university. And then the other stream is like you have an undergrad, then you can get accredited. But where the injustice happens is most of the students that I've had in the program are language teachers. So they teach their language, and then they get hired in the school. But then they say, we don't have to pay you the same as a accredited teacher because you're not accredited. So they have that inequity in terms of pay. And the students, like, I took the same program, high school, I have all this cultural knowledge and language, but it's not being recognized. So I'm trying to work on that right now to see how, even with the high school degree, if you do that program, that if there's if you're seen as being a language expert in your own language, that you should have accreditation. You would hope that people wouldn't use that excuse. They just say, hey, again, because it's nation to nation, that have different criteria in terms of what might be equal, right, as opposed to equity. So that's a great question that I'm still trying to figure out, and I'm on academic leave this year, so we'll see what happens when I go back.
Is that going to be your dissertation?
Oh, I'm just asking.
Sounds like a
That's
great
too
dissertation.
big for me to even, because like the sort of notion is that the subject English, let's say literature, say linguistics, these are posh subjects,
Yeah.
like elite subjects, and
Like Shakespeare, studying Shakespeare.
yeah. So essentially, when a student from a Bengali background, like a student who hardly ever speaks English, enters a classroom where the professor is fluent in English, and then he does not even speak to the students' queries or answer to the queries unless he speaks in English. This is an oppression to my, to be honest. Now that I have grown up, at that moment it was like very cool to me. It looked cool, sounded cool, but now I know better, like that wasn't cool. That wasn't good for any student. Because like there are 5-10 students who are always, they come from privileged classes, backgrounds, and they can speak English, they can talk, they can communicate in second language. Not necessarily, you cannot expect that from students who come from different backgrounds, and especially when Bengali is the national language. And I think for last 6-7 years, there were some departments who used to accept exam copies in Bangla, but now they do not accept any answer in our mother language.
Okay,
So
you're talking about
it has been changing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this is fossilized, in the name of globalization, but yeah.
And the complexity in Ontario is that Francophone communities are minorities, so Franco-Ontarians are a minority community. At Ottawa U, even if you take regardless of what course you take in what language, you're allowed to turn your assignments in your first language. So you can take a course with me in English, but if you want, I should be able to read your assignments in French because I'm supposed to be applied. So there's that. But I hear you in terms of what you're saying around, well, two things. In grade 11 now, they have to speak to like English in the course content and stuff. For the school boards, school districts for my sons, the Catholic school board, it's a publicly funded school board and then the Ottawa Carleton District School Board is another publicly funded English school boards. And at grade 11 now, students take they read First Nations, for English, either First Nations, Métis or Inuit literature, poetry, authors, and look at that in relation to contemporary issues. So that's grade 11 English, and all students across do that. So I've seen my boys go through and write about different things and what they're reading. And just coming back to what you said about the accent, or what some people have written about speaking white, like to speak English a certain way, is to think through that. And and for me as Vice Dean of Grad Studies, it was one of the frustrations, because all of a sudden I'm sitting in a meeting and people are talking about international students' investment portfolio to make up for the shortfall at the university, but want to know any services or to change the sense of unconditional welcome and supports and have the expectations that students, you come here, you have to speak a certain way, you have to write a certain way, and everything in terms of those exchanges on that side. I have a student now doing his doctorate. He's Francophone, he's from Africa, Cameroon, and he's looking at, because the majority of students in our Francophone teacher program are from Africa and Francophone or first-generation immigrants, and it's really hard for them to get employment in the school boards. So the Francophone school district says we're short teachers, qualified teachers, but there's all these of our students that can't get, and it's always framed as you need to learn and acculturate yourself to our culture, which is code for a Francophone white, old settler colonial community that's no longer the majority community that goes to the schools. And so he's looking at African theorists, so whether it's Mbembe or Fanon and others, and Césaire, and he's looking at concepts like negritude and Ubuntu, and then his own version, because he's part of the Jesuit order. I said, well, you come from Cameroon, what's your sensibility in terms of unconditional welcoming of our teachers to the program? So flip it. Say, how does the school and the administration have to change their mindset and the wider school community in terms of this transition of North Africa, West and North African Francophone families who've immigrated to Canada that make up the majority of some of the schools. So, so there's people doing and looking at that in different contexts. But that frustrates me sometimes, going and seeing the way some of my grad students are treated, just because of the way in which they try to speak English or French or seem to have an accent. When I started at, when my parents went to Canada, we immigrated from Georgetown, Guyana, and Glasgow, Scotland. I was born in Glasgow, Scotland. And for us to be good Canadians, we moved to a small rural logging town. My dad had a medical practice there, and they want us to learn both languages, so they put us in the French Catholic schooling system. So I was French second language learner my whole way through, and I never wanted to talk. I wanted to go into the sciences because I didn't have to write as much, because people would laugh because I had an accent. And even when I first got to Ottawa U and I wanted to participate in stuff, people would correct, certain colleagues would correct me, and they talk. And then finally, I just said, who cares? And I would just, try to, right? And then I get corrected, and and I'm like, have fun with the accent a little bit more. So, but I could do that. But you have to have, for others, the self-esteem being called out or whatever, those microaggressions, right? Just say, hey, was that a microaggression there? Did you just hold up my accent? So.
We're at about 15 minutes, or 20 minutes.
Yeah, and I'm not saying thank you for inviting me for the talk, but I'm not saying you have to do service or social justice. For some of my colleagues, it just to survive the settler colonial institution on a daily and to work within it is enough labor, and not to be seen to have to do all the labor in whatever setting, right? So for having that conversation with colleagues, hey, other people have to step up. It's not always because we have certain colleagues that they have to do that. So I had, just quickly, as Vice Dean, I was responsible for the hiring program, and I advocated for 2 positions in Black Youth Studies, and I got 2 amazing colleagues now, and they wanted them to teach the anti-racist education course, and the 2 colleagues said, I don't want to teach that. I want to be talking about that. I want to do work with Black youth, Black excellence, and I want to teach the courses I'm qualified. I love research methodology. I want to teach the ethnography course, And so certain people looking at them as administrators, like, no, you're this course, and I have to say, no, like, is there someone else that's, qualified that does research to teach that course? So it's often, like, in terms of certain people being seen how to do the heavy lifting in certain areas, as opposed to seeing, like, as a community, like, how do we each do our part?
Well, I agree, not everybody's going to do ethnography, not everybody's going to do oral history, but I think the issues you raise about what is our responsibility as researchers, whether you're doing quantitative, I've done archival work for the last 12 years now, and my question is, what's my responsibility to the dead? What is my responsibility when I tell the story of someone who is no longer there, but clearly has a story? And that needs to be told. So, and whether you do quantitative, there are certain responsibilities that I think we have, and I think what you speak to is a different foundational view of what is research. That research is not an epistemology. It's not just about gaining knowledge, but research is an ethical endeavor, because we're always engaging with human beings, even if they're data. That whatever data you look at, there's a person behind. There's a person behind that. So to me, research, no matter what methodology you use, is an ethical endeavor. And I think having it seen as an epistemology allows us to dehumanize and to not see the humanity.
Well, yeah.
The